Hello, and welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your ray-traced host, Madelyn.
I'm your low-res host, Emma.
And it's a side quest this week on the show. So it's Emma's turn to choose what we're talking about this week. So Emma, what's on the agenda?
This week I wanted to, I guess it's not a super specific topic, but I'd been thinking, like, what areas of games am I not actually very well versed in talking about? And I found the answer was the technical stuff. Stuff like all the hot buzzwords about games, like graphics and performance and stuff like that. Like, I hear them, I'm like, that's fancy. And then I move on with my life. And I thought we should take some time here on Talk This to reinforce our knowledge of such terms and terminology. So I thought that would be a good chance to do that through a side quest.
A learning episode this long weekend.
Yes. We're here to learn alongside you.
So, Emma, I sort of understood all of these things, right? I kind of vaguely knew what all of this was. But I do think, and you wrote this in the notes, as primarily console gamers, we've been kind of insulated from a lot of the more technical, graphical innovations.
Yeah. Yeah, because, your console is a standardized computer, right? When you buy a PlayStation 5, like a launch PlayStation 5, everyone who owns that system has the same specs, unless there's something wrong with it. So when you're developing a game for a console, you can target those specs and optimize your game for that system, right? You're like, this will work on this console. But when you're making a game for PC, everybody has different PCs, right? There isn't a standardized computer that everybody has when they're playing on their PC. Someone might be trying to play it on their really old laptop. Someone might be trying to play it on their super fancy RGB lights, funny fan, fancy computer that they built themselves. Maybe that's how do you build a computer? That could be our next learning experience.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be great. We can definitely do that for a side quest. Absolutely.
So you have this whole range of, like, power in the systems. So a lot of these terms are in that settings menu so that people playing the game can turn those up or down based on what their system can actually handle. So that's why you might see a lot more graphics options in a PC version of a game than you would in a console version of the game, because it's not necessary for the console version necessarily, but it is for the PC version.
Yeah, I've heard consoles described before as being like kind of low-end PCs.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that you wouldn't get too much into the really technical setting stuff.
Yes. I mean, the really high-end PCs are trying to make your own really high-end PC can run you in, like, thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas, a console is somewhere in the mid-hundreds. So it's just an affordable machine.
However, more of this stuff is coming to consoles and becoming more relevant for consoles as we reach, I have to stop calling it a new console generation because these things have been out for years now, but I don't have them. So a new console generation.
It's just a year and a half, right?
And coming up on 2, right?
That's what a year and a half means.
Oh my gosh. Okay, thank you. Yeah, you're right. One thing, though, that I think, in a slightly lesser way, but still more than many of the other things that we'll talk about on this list, has always been something that console gamers have had to think about a little bit, at least, is FPS, which is our first vocab term of the day.
Yes.
Emma, do you know what FPS means?
Yes, it means frames per second, which I did know prior to this.
Yes, me too.
Commonly, at the moment, games are either set to target 30 FPS or 60 FPS. With gamers, very much preferring 60 FPS. Some people are like, 30 FPS is unplayable, which is always so funny to me. So, I knew that, and, theoretically, I was like, oh, 60's better, right? There's more frames. We like more frames.
More frames.
But I never really thought about it. And even now, I watched some comparisons of 30 versus 60. And, there was one that put in slow motion 30, 60, and 120. And in slow motion, you can see the difference pretty clearly in the frames.
Of course.
So, 30 frames per second is, the game is set so it puts out 30 frames a second, 60 frames a second, 120 frames a second. And what you see as the player is based on your actual monitor, so your monitor's refresh rate. So if your monitor is 60 hertz, it will show you 60. It's capable of showing you 60 frames per second, but not any more than that. So why 30 and 60 is so popular is because a lot of monitors are 60 hertz, and if it's 30, they just, double it. So you'll get the same frame for 2 frames, basically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I had never realized, I had also wondered, why is it 30 and 60, and why do we never see 75 or 42 or something like that? And so that was one of the things that I learned for this week's episode, is that with that refresh rate, it's bad if you don't have a common denominator there. Or maybe it's not bad. If you're a competitive gamer, maybe it's not bad. But if you're concerned with not getting weird artifacts and stuff on your screen, it is bad.
Yeah.
Because what can happen, right, is if you have a 45 game per second, 45 frame per second situation, right? Sometimes when it's refreshing, it's going to catch it kind of in the middle of its frame cycle. And so you're going to get something that's half one frame and half the other. And that's weird and not desirable.
I still don't fully get it, because the standard for film, I think, is 24 frames a second.
Yeah.
So I don't really get how that works still.
I wonder if it has anything to do with the fact that, film is obviously not creating itself in real time.
Yeah.
So maybe it's more possible for it to... Yeah, that part, this isn't a film podcast, so didn't quite look into that as much. But I would guess that it has something to do with the fact that, the film is all there. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Anyway, like I was saying before this, I watched some, side-by-side comparisons. I watched a slow motion one that wasn't slow motion, that was Fall Guys, and one that didn't put them side by side, just put them in sequence of Red Dead Redemption 2. And the less it was, I could really see it in the slow motion. I could sort of see it in the side by side, and it was very hard for me to see it in the sequential one, which, people have different eyes.
Right.
So I fully believe that for some people, the frames make more of a difference for them when they're watching something. And maybe I am just not able to perceive that as well for some reason. But even though I can see it when you put it side by side, if you just booted up a game, some people can be like, oh, this is running at 30, or oh, this is running at 60. I have no idea. If you just opened one game and was like, what is this running at? I would be like, I don't know. It's running fine.
At game. Run the game.
It's running a game.
Yeah, I've had similar problems in looking at some of these, yeah, side by side across a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today, honestly. Some of that may be, I'm sure, that I do not have a high end computer. And
Hmm.
so I imagine that if you have a powerful gaming PC and you're watching these side by side comparisons, maybe your monitor is better at doing that in video form than my like MacBook, right?
Mm.
So I'll grant that. And not, I don't have a particularly nice television either. It's fine. So
Hmm.
I'll acknowledge that, like, yeah, maybe okay, maybe if you do have that like fancy gaming PC, you're literally able to see it more, right? But given
Yeah.
that, well, I don't know, gaming PCs are such a foreign concept to me, right? Like,
Yeah.
I've never had one. It's unbelievable to me that there are like how many people there must be out there that know how to build their own computers for
Yeah.
gaming. Like, what a thing to know how to do. Kudos. I don't mean this. It sounds like I'm saying this in a bad way. I'm not. I think it's cool, but it's also unbelievable to me that there are so many people who understand at least some of the specifics of graphical technology. It's like, I just didn't think people were that smart.
Well, clearly we're not.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I was like, I thought I was pretty smart. But apparently there are a bunch of just randos running around building their own $10,000 computers. And I'm like, I just
Yeah.
didn't think people were that smart or that rich. So learn new things every day.
Well, you save for it, right? And you put it in your budget.
I know. Still, though.
Also, graphics cards, well, they're starting to go back to normal, I think. Graphics cards. There was definitely a period where it was like, maybe you can't buy these right now.
So, Emma, why would you want a higher frame rate? What's the point?
Well, it gives you more information, right? You're able to see more of what is happening on the screen, which since games are interactive, uh, especially if you're doing something like, I can see why frames are super important for like fighting games, for instance.
Yeah.
Right. If you're a high level fighting games player, any sort of visual information that you're getting on like what your opponent's character is doing is probably very helpful for determining what you should be doing in response to that. Right? If you get you're able to see a couple more frames of like a wind up or something, you can respond to that versus, if it cuts some in the middle.
That's also wild to me, though. Whose eyes can see that fast? I understand
It's like
it, right? I
instinctive.
understand it.
It's not, I don't think it's much different than like, you're on a soccer field and you are watching someone and you're like, oh, they're going to kick it in this direction because I can see what their body is doing.
I know.
Right.
But I don't think of myself seeing 30 frames of people a second when I look around with my eyes. How many frames per second are my eyes?
I don't know. I don't think the world has frames exactly. Maybe it does. Maybe you could break it down. I didn't look that far into the science part of it.
Yeah. All I'm saying is, again, it's just another one of those things where it's like, man, 30 frames per second, that seems like a lot of frames. That seems like a lot. It seems like more than I could see already. And this is, again, it's like, oh yeah, like 60 does make a difference. But it's just wild to talk about, right? Imagine talking to like Pablo Picasso or whatever about frames per second. Imagine talking to the locomotive film guy about frames per second. He'd be like, what are you talking about? We have 2 frames per second.
Mm-hmm.
But Emma, are there situations where more frames are bad? Surely not. Let's just have more frames forever. 1,000 frames per second. 1,800 frames per second.
Well, I mean, like I said, when your monitor can only display so much, although apparently there is some benefit to maybe the game outputting more frames than your thing can show. although I didn't fully understand that when I was reading about it. But, of course, the more frames that you have, the less demanding your games needs to be resolution-wise. Obviously, if you have a lot of stuff to render on the screen, it becomes harder and harder to support as many frames because everything has to move at that frame rate, right? So, if you've got a character with like a lot of little dangly bits, for example, when they turn, all the little dangly bits have to like turn with them, in physics, and having all that happening at the same time can take a toll on the frame rate. So rather than like just being like the frame rate will do what it wants to do, you have different situations in the game where it might be able to handle more or less frame rates. So if you're like mostly running at 120 frames per second, but every once in a while the game dips to like 80, that also looks bad. You'll notice that, right?
That's my frame rate experience, right? I can't tell when I'm playing on my PlayStation how many frames per second something is running, but I can tell when it is having a hard time running.
Yes. I mean, the benefit to having, I said 120 to 80, but that's going to be less noticeable than if you're going from 30 to 15.
Right.
Right. So that is some benefit to having a higher frame rate, is that it's more forgiving if you happen to drop some frames sometimes, because you're still getting a lot of them. Even if you happen to notice that it slows down for a minute, it doesn't slow down to slideshow levels.
Which is always the goal. We want to avoid slideshow.
Yes.
Fancy monitors and fancy consoles now are starting to support variable refresh rate, which does theoretically help with, either frames per second amounts that aren't the standard 30 or 60, or potentially with ones that change throughout a little bit. It's the idea where your fancy television can be told by your fancy console how many frames per second it's updating and can update its hertz accordingly. Which, man, somebody has to explain that to their family at Thanksgiving, that that's what they do.
Yeah.
Which must be hard.
Yeah. But of course, every innovation in gaming is limited by, like, the number of people that have devices that can actually support these things. Right? Like, one of the big hip things from, like, I don't know, like 5 to 10 years ago was, like, HDR.
Right.
So HDR is high, what is it?
Dynamic range.
Dynamic range. And that has to do with, like, contrast in color. So it can show, like, a wider variety of colors, basically, than a standard dynamic range.
Yeah, so it provides, like, better detail and extreme light and extreme dark, basically.
Yes. But, of course, if you put HDR in the game, you can't automatically see that. You need a monitor that supports HDR. So when that was being introduced in games, I actually still don't know if my TV supports high dynamic range. I haven't looked into it. So sometimes I'll boot up a game and it'll ask me, like, do you want HDR on? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't care.
Emma likes her dynamic range standard.
Oh, I just don't know. I usually turn it off because I'm like, I have no idea. I could probably look it up if it does, but I don't care that much. But there was even when it was like, oh, it's possible now, there wasn't necessarily any reason to introduce it until a larger number of people of your consumer base had HDR, like, especially on consoles is what I'm talking about. Like, if most people in your user base don't have that kind of TV yet, then there's not very much point in offering it as an option.
That's something I wonder about with PC gaming as well, though. I do feel like, there's this culture of, like, more graphics, better I mean, this is true across games, but in PCs in particular, it's like more frames, better graphics, higher resolution, ultra wide, forever and ever. And that's great, but I do wonder what percentage of PC gamers are really able to take advantage of even like 50% of that. Right? How many people actually have a gaming PC that works better than a PlayStation 5? I don't know.
I mean, I don't know either, but there's certainly a higher percentage of PC gamers who have that than people who just play on console, right?
No, right, of course. I'm just wondering, like, if I look at the population of people who play games on PC, and, like, let's say if I look at the population of people who play, like, I don't know, like Call of Duty or Counter-Strike or, like, something like that on PC, right? Like, I'll do us a favor and exclude the folks who are like me, who would be, playing something. I mean, obviously I don't even count as a PC gamer on my Mac, right? But, like, people who would be playing something, low demand that wouldn't even necessarily, not that I saw plenty of screenshots, people being like, here's ray traced Minecraft. It's like, man, that's not the point of Minecraft. Well,
that's available on Xbox.
I know that. All that I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is, okay, let's say if I just look at players who are playing games where these graphical options might enhance the experience, how many of them are playing on this, like, I'm running around as a blobby potato to make this run on my 10-year-old computer? I feel like probably more than you'd think.
Well, yeah. That's why you are able to turn things down, too.
Right.
Like, they don't just offer all these options on PCs so that you can make it run really well. They offer it because there are low-end PCs that also need to run this game. So you might want to turn off shadows, for instance.
Puddles.
Yeah.
So we've talked about frame rate. You started to talk about resolution. I think it's probably wrong to refer to them as, like, the flip side of the coin, but that's sort of how I think about it a little bit.
Well, I mean, the two most common presets for games are performance mode and sometimes they just call it graphics mode, sometimes they call it resolution mode, sometimes they call it something else. But basically one prioritizes your frame rate, while the other prioritizes your resolution, essentially. Because the more resolution you have, the harder it is on the game to offer a certain number of frames. And the more frames you have, the harder it is for a game to render the full amount of detail that it can. So you choose which one that you want, essentially.
I do love the false advertising in resolution names. You gave me a lovely explanation of why 2K and 4K are called that. And I did understand that that's why they were called that, but they aren't actually 2K and 4K. They're, like, pretty close.
Well, they can be more or less.
I know.
It's like everything from, like, 3800 to, like, 4200 is 4K. So my understanding is stuff like 1080p, which you might, if you're changing the resolution on, like, your YouTube video
right.
to make it run better, depending on your internet, you can go from, like, 140p to 1080p. And that is, like, that's just the number of pixels, right? Like, the full number, is that correct?
No, it's the number of rows, I think.
It's the number of rows, okay. Well, then I guess it's the same as 4K, isn't it?
No, 1080p I thought was actually 1080.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. You just said it was the number of rows.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 4K is the same, except that it's usually not actually 4K.
Okay. Well, that's more of an abbreviation. You could still say, like, 3800p.
I know. I just thought it was a fun little marketing ploy that they were like, it's really 3700p, but let's call it 4K. Fancy.
Yeah, so 4K is like the horizontal display, the number of pixels that it is wide. Maybe it's wide, right?
Yeah, so I guess that's columns. I can never keep track of which one is which in dimensions, so.
Yeah. So the more pixels, obviously, which are the little, they're the little square things that make up the display of your monitor. They're these little square pieces of color that when you put them all together, they make an image. That's a pixel. The more pixels you have, the clearer and more detailed your image can be, right? Because the more pixels you have, the smaller they get, so the more granular control you have over the image that you're displaying.
The irony of this conversation is that on my hotel Wi-Fi right now, Emma is made of like 8 pixels.
Yeah.
It's not quite that bad, but she's like talking about it and I'm like, oh wow, look at her. Look at the blocky Emma that I'm looking at. Minecraft Emma.
Yeah. So something that's like 140p, you can just make out like the suggestion of what you're looking at, basically. Whereas if something is 4K, you can see like the lush forest or whatever.
But Emma, how many pixels is too many pixels? Have we already reached the maximum human pixel amount?
Well, people are going for 8K, but whether or not that actually is a difference that you can perceive at that point is somewhat a point of debate, I believe.
Yeah, I've loved that everything that I have read about 8K is like, oh, but you can't actually see it. You can't actually tell.
Yeah. I mean, at a certain point for everything, you get to diminishing returns, right?
Yeah.
If something is already convincingly showing you, like, realistic movement or convincingly showing you a detailed environment, doubling that at some point is just like, well, it sure is still a realistic portrayal of movement or a realistic environment. Again, I feel like it is a thing, like we're hitting a point where people have different amount of ability to perceive that, so 8K might make a difference for some people, but it's definitely less of a difference than going from like 1080p to 4K for the wide majority of people.
Right.
I feel like a lot of graphics are getting to the point now where maybe there's some people who can tell the difference, but the majority of people aren't going to see much change between 4K and 8K, or like 120 frames per second and 240 frames per second.
It does make you wonder, like, do you think people looking at paintings in the 1700s were like, it's never going to get more realistic than this? Like, most people can't even see that the dog has a face.
Maybe, I don't know. People in art have like more of an appreciation for like brush strokes, like visible brush strokes. So, I don't know. I can imagine people with photographs looking at this, being like, "This is it."
Yeah, that's true. That's fair. I was taking an extreme example, but you're right that it's probably better that somebody took a photograph and they were like, "This is the best photographs can ever be."
Yeah.
Because I'm not about photographs, about the realism of games. I'm like seeing that a little bit. I'm like, surely we're getting close.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, surely we're like 90% of the way there that we're ever going to be. But there's a reason that I don't work in technology, because I'm sure like everyone at NVIDIA is like, no, it's not. Smell-o-vision is coming next.
Well, that's different, right?
I know. I'm just kidding.
I think that there will be more. I feel like my impression, like VR, still obviously needs some work.
Right.
But that's like applying things onto like a different technology, right? Versus like improving it more, I guess. Is sort of how it feels like the sector is heading. But what do I know? I don't know.
Nothing. I wonder if we'll ever move away from square pixels.
How would you change it? Magic? Yeah. I mean, they're squares so that they fill the screen, right?
Maybe one day we'll just have magic screens.
Sure. I mean, it's like the reason they can't be circular is because then they can't.
No, I understand. I understand
sit
why they
next
have
to
be
each
square.
other. I guess you could make them triangles, but honestly, what would that do exactly? Nothing.
I don't know. I was using this as a transition to our aliasing next topic, but mostly I was just saying maybe one day we'll have magic screens that don't have pixels at all, and they can just make images.
I don't think that's how that works, but yeah.
Why won't the little man in my computer just draw the images for me? Why does he need to have a bunch of squares?
Here's the thing: when you draw something, you are in fact using the pixels, Madeline.
Oh, no, you're not. You're using your pencil, Emma. Come on. It's called a pencil.
But a pencil isn't perfect. Can't be perfectly round sometimes either, doesn't it?
I know. I'm just being silly. Stop roasting me.
I'm just telling you what it is.
Tell me what aliasing is.
Sure. So, because a pixel is square, it has sharp edges, right? It has corners and lines. So when you are rendering something that's round, like a circular smiley face, for example, because the pixel cannot be round, you will sometimes get jagginess on the sides where you can sort of see where things aren't quite lining up correctly because they're straight or angled. So especially at lower resolutions, you'll be able to see sort of like a fuzziness or jagginess to the edges of a circular shape because you can see where the pixels are. So anti-aliasing is something that sort of smooths that out. I don't really understand how it does it, but it does.
Well, there are a lot of different ways that they do it.
Yeah.
Basically. Some more demanding than others. My understanding of this, and again, lots of places that you can read about this and probably get a more technical understanding of it than Emma and I can provide, but we're going to do our best. But so basically, some versions of anti-aliasing, and the ones that are in many ways probably very, like, quite common and low demand, are ones that basically put a filter on your, like, graphic output, right? So it goes through, it kind of smooths out the edges. Sometimes it does that because it knows where the polygons, and sometimes it just sort of does it based on the 2D image on the screen, right? But those can cause some blurring, depending on what kind you use, but they're not going to destroy your frame rate as they go, theoretically. I mean, depending on what kind of computer you're on, right?
Yeah. Or the game.
Or the game, right? A lot of things that this can depend on. But there are also ones where it's like the game takes a sample of kind of all the pixels around it, right, and uses that. Or there's ones where essentially it renders the game at a higher resolution than you're running it and then downscales it. So, like, you have these pixels that kind of contain multiple pixels, if that makes sense. Like, it allows it to figure out where those edges should be and smooth it out. that is quite demanding, though, on your
Yeah.
computer. And so if you don't have a high quality device, how much is that worth it? Right?
Yeah.
NVIDIA is now using like a neural network thing to do this, which feels like a lot for some slightly jaggy edges, but you know, deep learning super sampling, it's the way of the future.
Oh dear.
Oh dear indeed. The anti-aliasing in some images I'm able to see, particularly like there's one where it's just like black circles on a white background in one of Emma's articles here, and it's like that's very clear. But there was another article I was reading that was doing it, and people in the comments were complaining like, why are you showing this with these like 480p screenshots? Like you can't see it, they're tiny. And I was like, oh good, like I'm glad that it's not just me that's looking at these like cross sections of an image with different filters applied to each one and being like, okay.
Yeah, it is very granular at a certain point, right? Because the smaller pixels are, obviously the less jagginess you'll see at the edge of an image.
Exactly. So, you know, maybe one day we'll have perfectly smooth lines, and won't that be exciting for us all?
Very exciting.
I feel like the new hot thing is ray tracing.
Yes. So, ray tracing is a lighting technique. It's just what it sounds like. You have a light source in the scene, and it traces every ray of that light source to more realistically render the way that light actually plays off objects, essentially. So, it's essentially, like, rather than having, like, a general impression, it's just, like, there's this light source, every single bit of light that comes off of it is sort of tracked and played into the environment based on what's around there. So essentially it's just a more realistic way of rendering light in a digital space.
And we gotta have it.
Yeah, people love it.
It's so fascinating for me that so there are only a few games that really use this right now. I mean, more and more coming, but there's never been a fully ray traced game.
Yeah, I mean, consoles, this new generation of consoles can handle it, I believe. I don't think any of the previous ones could. So now that it is available on consoles, it's more reasonable to work that into your like development cycle, right? Because it's not like I would like to hit the ray tracing button.
Yeah.
Right? You have to do it and then make sure it works and that it actually looks good and all this other sort of stuff, right? It's a different technique of lighting, so it requires different work on it to make sure it actually looks good.
Work in my video game.
Yeah, and then not the magical elves that make my video games, you know? This was like a big thing with Cyberpunk, for instance, which is understandable, right? Because when you have like a cyberpunk neon city, it makes sense that you want like these lights to be immersive.
Yeah.
Right? If you're relying on like a neon aesthetic, especially, you'd be like, yeah, ray tracing seems like the way to go to make sure that like that feeling is actually captured within the game. Whether they weren't super, well, you know, it was good for high-end PCs, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, everybody wants ray tracing now, so that's like the new thing for games to be marketed on.
Can't wait for my rays to be traced. So excited. It's gonna really revolutionize my gaming experience.
Yeah. And ray tracing, by the way, isn't just a video game thing. It's just like a rendering thing.
Yeah.
So you'll see ray tracing in like animated movies as well. It just, that is probably easier because, again, film doesn't have to run in like real time.
Yes, film, everything I was seeing about film is like, film can have like a bajillion computers do this effect for it, and they just have to capture it.
Yes.
As opposed to, your game has to do this on your, like, 7-year-old PS4. So, someplace where the movies have an advantage, they can use as many computers as they want to trace as many rays as they so desire. The next thing on our list, I do feel like is it's so stupid because it's like, it's a dumb thing, and it's like not even really like a high-end graphics thing. It's just a please do this graphics thing. But draw distance, I feel like, is my graphic pet peeve.
Yeah. Not all of these are like high-end things. I was just picking terms to make sure that we covered a lot of like the big topics. So draw distance is like when you stand in a game and look out at like a horizon, how much is loaded in that you can see, right? So if you have a short draw distance, and some of this is more, it's not like you're like, I have a draw distance of 30 meters necessarily. Like some things may load in and some things may not if your draw distance isn't consistent. So you'll get stuff like pop-ins, which people complain about in like Pokemon, for example, where you'll like be running around and suddenly there's something like 10 feet in front of you that wasn't there before that you've seen like pop into the environment, when if it was like a real thing and you were running around, you would have been able to see that thing far before.
Yeah, pop-in is my big pet peeve. Specifically in Pokemon and in Katamari Damacy, neither of which are especially high-end graphical games, so you live with it. But it is so
Katamari is very dense, though.
No, I totally understand why Katamari has to do this, right? It is not a complaint of, this is stupid, it's not even that demanding, but it is sometimes frustrating when you're big and you're trying to choose what direction to go in, and you can't decide because you can't see anything.
Yes.
So, my one little thing on this list that I do actually notice and sometimes I'm frustrated by is that pop-in.
Yeah. This also isn't like a lot of what big open worlds will do, for instance, is there'll be a certain point where something might change from its high definition model to a low poly model. Because things that are farther away, you can't see in detail anyway, right?
Right.
So if you're in a game and you see like birds flying overhead, if you were to take the camera and actually go and look at those birds, they will look like horrifying monstrosities because there's no need to realistically render a pigeon that's like thousands of feet in the sky above you, right? You just need the suggestion of a pigeon. And that also takes less resources to render if it's like this twisted mess of polygons than if you made a lovingly created pigeon that's flying up there. Like then if you happen to like walk closer to the bird, they might switch out the model from its horrifying monstrosity to an actual thing that looks like an
actual pigeon.
Yes. They'll do this with like trees, for example, too. Like you'll see trees in the distance, and actually some of those trees might just be 2D, actually.
Yeah.
They might just have like a thing that looks like a tree the same way that like a skybox works. They do not 3D render the sky, usually. This may be surprising. There's like a dome. You're within like a dome, basically, that shows the sky.
We'll see. Coming soon.
I mean, it could be hard to do. It's So, like, Final Fantasy VII Remake has, like, various different skyboxes that have to show, like, the underside of the plate or the city below you, and they're all, like, varying degrees of realistic.
Didn't they update those? I feel like they released better skyboxes.
Well, I'm sure they did in the PS5 version, yes. I'm sure they updated it. There's, like, one that, like, shows the city below when you're, like, crossing to, like, go to the underside of the plate to, like, go to the second reactor bombing. That was very low res in the original. Though, so when you look down, you're like, that's a picture.
That's what it's like in the post-apocalyptic world. You don't get a sky. It's not post-apocalyptic, the incoming apocalyptic world. You don't get a sky, you just get a picture of a sky.
Yeah. So, yeah. So there's different ways to, like, manipulate draw distance of, like, it can load in lower quality versions of things and still make it seem like you're seeing very far. Even though once you actually get to that area, it probably would have loaded in entirely new assets to make it look realistic there.
Games are crazy, dude.
Yeah. Held together with toothpicks, mostly.
I feel like a motion blur is your television pet peeve.
So this is different. Motion blur is different. There's motion smoothing that a lot of TVs have nowadays, which is awful, and I hate it.
Yeah.
And what motion smoothing does, essentially, is it, like, guesses and adds frames to things that were filmed at different frame rates. I don't know exactly what it knocks it up to, but if you turn on the TV at someone else's house and you've been like, why does this look like a soap opera? You're, like, watching an episode of, like, Friends, and you're like, why are they moving like that? It's creepy. That's probably because the TV has motion smoothing turned on. Which it does, like, a similar rudimentary thing of, like, people who like to, like, AI upscale things to 60 FPS.
Which
like,
Emma hates too.
Film. Yeah. Like, film or animation. Like, some people actually put work into that and, like, adjust it manually, whereas this is, like, all automatic, and it just creates, like, a blurred mess, essentially. If you, like, frame by frame through something that's been upscaled or motion blurred, you'll see times when, like, parts of the image, like, break because it's just, like, an AI guessing at what's supposed to be there, and it's sort of just, like, it's not good. I don't like it. Sometimes I go on YouTube and, like, watch things that have been AI upscaled because I hate myself. They're so ugly. I don't understand why people like them. Anyway. So that's what motion smoothing is. Motion blur is, in a game, it's just trying to imitate how a camera works in real life. So if you're filming a movie and you turn a camera real fast, or even if you just have your head and you turn your head real fast, things sort of blur, right? Because they're moving fast. So games will insert, when you turn the camera, this sort of motion blur to sort of emulate that. Yeah. Only it's not very good at it. It's just sort of sickening a lot of the times, I find, when motion blur. I turn it off usually if I have the option. So it can be an aesthetic thing to make it seem more like film. A lot of people also accused it of just being something where they're trying to disguise a dropping frame rate, right? If you turn the camera real fast and the frame rate drops a bit, the motion blur sort of hides that because you can't see things as clearly.
Right.
So in some ways it's like a technical band-aid as well. But, I mean, if you're playing a game where you have to, like, constantly be looking around, motion blur can get a bit nauseating. Because you're turning the camera a lot more in games all of the time than you would in film. You know, where you might use a lot of, like, turning the camera to, like, show that a scene is, like, panicky or frantic or fast. Whereas if you're just playing the game all the time, you don't necessarily need every scene to feel fast or panicky, right?
Yeah.
You might just want to be able to turn your camera.
It is interesting to me how many game effects are taken from film in ways that they don't need to be. Right? Theoretically, there's no need to have motion blur. There's no need to have the aesthetic, the lens flare, right? All of that stuff. But because we have this visual vocabulary from movies, and I guess from life, although I don't think you get too much lens flare in life, that like it has to be expressed here too.
You do get bloom in
Yes.
real life. Yeah.
Yes. Lots of it.
Games very much, I find that games do overdo bloom sometimes too.
Well, we overdo it in our Instagram photos too, you know? So it's just like, I mean, not anymore so much, but in the early days, everybody loves bloom.
Yeah. That's essentially just like when you move from like a dark to a light area, there'll be like a warm of light, and then it'll come focused in, which can be uncomfortable depending on how much they overdo it.
Well, Emma, have we missed any major vocab you want for the quiz today?
I think we've covered a lot of it. I mean, there's a lot more to that, and if you went into like the actual development process, you'd probably find more terms that have to do with like the various things that we have discussed.
Yes, this was a very intro level overview.
Yeah. But I do think that doing this research helped me understand a little bit more about what people are talking about with this.
Yeah.
Even if I sort of feel the same about it in that I am mostly unconcerned.
I understand a little better why certain people might be concerned, and I understand a little better why certain people might think they should be concerned, but they aren't.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be. But yeah, I do sort of feel like, well, I'm continuing to work with pretty low-level hardware here, and so I'll continue to be impressed with my games being sort of more realistic, but maybe not photorealistic.
Yeah. I mean, all of these things don't have to necessarily be applied to photorealism, too.
Oh, no, I know. I'm sorry. That was...
You can use ray tracing on something that isn't necessarily photorealistic. FPS and resolution are obviously self-explanatory.
Well, listeners, thanks for tuning in to this educational episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
Listeners, did you learn something? Or are you a PC gamer out there being like, I knew all of this. I have the latest NVIDIA GeForce blurgity blurg computer card zone.
Yeah, that.
If you got the latest NVIDIA blurgity blurg, let me know. But if you don't, hopefully you learned something. Or even if you did, hopefully you learned something. I certainly did. We didn't even talk about how cloud gaming can be used. Like, and cloud gaming is so silly. It's like, you can export it. I mean, that's silly. You can export it to a higher level computer, but you have to have absolutely the best internet in the world.
Yes.
To see it. But anyway, listeners, if you enjoyed the episode, why don't you follow us on social media? We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can learn all about the show, check out the games that are in the hat for our main episodes, and read our blog featuring long-running series, Clickbait Boyfriend, Split Screen, and Emma's monthly blogs. Final Fantasy 13, right?
Yep. Was cool. Last month's. Was May and June's, specifically.
So, check it out. But most importantly, if you enjoy the show, why don't you subscribe? We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, anywhere that you can find podcasts, you can find Talk This. I don't remember next week's games.
I think next week's games are Batman Arkham Asylum.
Yes.
And 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim.
Right, because I was like, Batman's a Sentinel. I remember now. Yes, of course. So look forward to that next week, and in 2 weeks, I can't believe it's that time again. It's our 6 weeks in gaming. So tune in for that side quest in a couple weeks.
Be exciting one.
But that's it for this week's show. Thanks for listening. Emma, do you have an outro?
This week, I hope that your eyes show you enough frames to live.